Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Hey, Tampa Bay! Welcome to the Morgan Streetman Show, and we're overjoyed to have Pat George back today.
And you see, I'm standing up for this show.
I see you are.
The information on this show comes so fast and furious, you just can't sit down. You got to stand up.
You got to stand up for this one, and we got a lot to cover today, folks, so we'll just jump right into it. You know, we wanted to take a quick look back at a story that we've covered a number of times on this show, and it's one that finally some studies are coming out about. You know, we hate to be sort of Luddites and against the adoption of these new technologies, but when we saw those e-scooters show up over in Tampa,
oh, here we go.
We told you there were going to be problems. We told you all you got to do is use your common sense. And, of course, I've been the victim myself of being on one of these kind of devices and falling off of it. I mean, it's easy to do when you got the itty-bitty wheels and you got the center of gravity of a person is much, much higher than that. You get the thing going 10 or 15 miles an hour, you hit a bump and you're going right off that thing, right off of it. So what we wanted to share with you is some studies have finally come out on injuries from these e-scooters, and they came out of the University of California, San Francisco, and they're showing that there is a surge, an absolute surge in injuries from these e-scooters. In fact, in about the last, it actually goes back a little further than that because the studies are only up to date through 2018, but between 2014 and 2018, so that's 4 years, there was a huge increase in injuries on these scooters, and that's about when they started placing them in cities like San Francisco and other cities that are a little bit more advanced, quote unquote, than Tampa. And this particular set of studies appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Journal Surgery. And so it basically shows that there were 4,582 injuries between 2014 and 2018. There were 4,500 in 2014. By 2018, there were 14,651. So, And what that amounts to is a 3 times increase, or about 365% increase in injuries that required people to go to hospitals. And, of course, we don't know how many injuries have occurred, minor strains and sprains and other things. But the type of injuries that were showing up at hospitals, the most frequent injury is an extremity fracture, so a fracture of your arm, your hand.
Oh, that one.
Those are bad, right? Those are very painful. They're going to require some kind of medical intervention, possibly surgery, depending on how bad they are. But at a minimum, you're going to probably have to have a cast, and you're going to be dealing with that. So that was 42% of the injuries that showed up were fractures in people's extremities. Now, get this one, Pat George. Now it gets really serious, because a fourth of the injuries that showed up were facial fractures. So you go flying off of this thing, you smack your face on the concrete. Now, not to mention the fact that you're going to get all kinds of abrasions and things from the concrete, but you're talking about teeth, noses, cheek fractures, orbital fractures. Facial fractures were fully 1/4 of these injuries. Now we're going to get to even more serious than that. About a fifth of the injuries or what they call intracranial hemorrhages, or that's also known as brain bleeds. So now you're talking about traumatic brain injury, which means brain damage. So 1 out of every 5 people or so that's injured on one of these e-scooters is getting a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. It's probably a concussion, and maybe even more serious than that. Could be long-term damage. Anytime you have a TBI, you can easily have long-term damage. So this is what's going on with those e-scooters as they've continued to deploy them in cities around the country, and we've seen an increase in their usage, including in Tampa. And I'll tell you what, all you got to do is drive around Tampa and watch the way that people are behaving on these e-scooters. And oh, by the way, if you want to look into this a little bit further, another thing they tested was what about the blood alcohol level of the people reporting to the hospital with these injuries? What about the presence of drugs in their system? And they found, no surprise, a high degree of these folks getting injured have a blood alcohol level of some significance. So they've been drinking, and a lot of them also have been using some type of drugs. So that's who we've got riding around on these scooters. And like I said, all you got to do is drive around Tampa, And you got to realize that's what's going on, because as you drive around, these people are darting in and out of traffic. They're not following any of the traffic laws. They're not stopping when they should stop. You don't have any idea what they're going to do. Now, no wonder people are getting injured on these things.
What's the strangest thing you've seen? Because I know you're in an area where you see these all the time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I see gangs of them. That's what I see. It's just gangs of people, which, I mean, is frankly, it's like you need to be a little bit tougher than riding around on an e-scooter. Now, they're not real gangs, but they're gangs of people going out and doing things at night. And the whole group of them be riding around on the scooters. And they basically take over the streets. And they're sort of weaving in and out of each other. And a lot of people, I see them sort of weaving back and forth across the lanes. And I guess they think they're having fun. I'm watching them. I'm thinking, man, you just hit one bump or something. You're off that thing. And next thing you know, you've fractured your arm. You've broken your foot. You've got some kind of brain bleed going on from some intracranial hemorrhaging. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And of course, unless it happens to you, and particularly if you're a young person and you haven't had this kind of experience, you tend to feel invincible. And you think, well, look, everybody's doing it. I'm not going to get hurt. I mean, come on. This is the modern era. We're supposed to ride these things around.
I thank you for bringing this up, because I thought one day I might get on one of those. Absolutely not will I with those kind of statistics.
Stay away from it, Pat George. Stay absolutely as far away from it as you can. And like I said, all you really have to do, folks, is just use your common sense. You get this thing going 12 or 15 miles an hour, and look at how small the wheels are, and what happens if you hit a bump. I mean, what do you think is going to happen? You think about inertia. Your body, where all the weight is tall. It's up high. It's going to keep going. I mean, if you hit a bump wrong on a bicycle, you can go flying over the handlebars, right? And that has big wheels that can, accommodate a lot of bumps. But anyway, these e-scooters, I think, are an inherently dangerous form of transportation, and it always surprises me to see so many people getting on them. Look, I like to have fun too, but it's just not wise. You don't want to be one of these statistics. And speaking of statistics, we got to get into our next story, because we got a lot of local interest today to cover, and some real tragedies, and particularly what happened on Bayshore last Thursday. Pat, I know you're shaking your head. I know you've heard about this, and you're big on traffic, and you're big on safe driving and all that stuff. Well, last week on Bayshore, a man was driving in his work truck, a pinch-a-penny truck, and he was apparently doing between 60 and 70 miles per hour on
double the speed limit.
Bayshore, right? It's 35 now on Bayshore, and that's from people being killed last year trying to cross Bayshore and getting run down by a couple of street racers. But this guy wasn't necessarily street racing. He was just high on whiskey, weed, and speed. And this is 11 o'clock in the morning in Tampa. Now, granted, he was a pool guy, so, those guys, I think, tend to, at least what I've heard, tend to be into some of that stuff. But I guess his morning routine consisted of smoking a joint at about 7 o'clock in the morning. And then as he was getting in his truck to go around, I guess, and do some pulls, he thought, well, why not? I'm just going to have a few shots of Fireball whiskey. Just kind of get me waked up, get me ready for the day, right? And I guess he was also, according to Tampa Bay Times, he also had some kind of amphetamine and speed in his system, so he was also a partaker of that kind of drug. When he was tested at the hospital, his blood alcohol content was 0.234, which is more than 3 times, or approximately 3 times, the legal limit. Now, he's only 31 years old, Benjamin Ehas, and, it's a really tragic story, because I'm sure he didn't intend to do this, but this is what happens when you don't behave responsibly and you don't think ahead about what the consequences of your actions will be. And he killed a very nice man. I mean, they were talking about it in church yesterday, just how many connections this gentleman that he killed, George Gage, who was just a pillar of the community, and his life is now over with, obviously. His family is devastated. It's funny because, Richard Gonsmart, who doesn't, right? He was apparently driving and was passed by this crazy driver and even talked to the Tampa Bay Times about it and said, I knew he was going to hit and kill somebody because of the speed at which he was driving on Bayshore. So he was one of the first ones to the scene, Richard Gonsmart was. And, this is pretty scary. He said that that the gentleman's shoes, George Gage's shoes, were still where he was standing when he was hit. So this guy hit him so hard, knocked him right out of his shoes, right over the balustrade, right into the water. And, a couple of good Samaritans went and jumped in the water and tried to save him. But, at that point, when you've been hit like that by a vehicle with that much inertia and that much weight behind it, there's just nothing that can be done. And he passed away. Really, really tragic story. And, we've got a few. I've got some more local interest stories for you to go. I've got 5 or 6 left. So we've got a lot more to cover on that. And then we want to get into some of the DOJ corruption and hopefully some Iran. And then we'll go out there. Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show, and we're going to stick with our local interest segment today. We've got an extended one because I've got so many stories I wanted to share with you from around the state of Florida, but also wanted to tell you I don't know just the way the time is passing, and you only get like 42 minutes on this show total airtime, which is just not enough. But I wanted to tell you, there's some really interesting stuff going on in Iran in terms of protests, and I really hope we're going to be able to get to a little bit of it. I think the way the show is passing, we're not going to get to a lot of the detail that I wanted to cover. But I wanted to tell you there's some videos out there that you can go and see. The mainstream media is misleading you as to what's going on in Iran, and it's misleading you as to the support for that evil regime that exists in Iran, that has suppressed and oppressed the people's will, and the Iranian people, the Persian people, have been under this evil regime for more than 40 years, and they've been totally suppressed. And some of that's coming out, and you know what? They're brave enough to stand up and have protests about it when it means in their country that happens at the cost potentially of your life, because the government forces will open fire into the crowd at the protest. So we'll hope to get to some of that as the show progresses. I don't know if we'll make it, but back to our own shores, I wanted to share a little something for you. Maybe some good news finally. And, of course, this is another story that it's not nearly as sad as the one we just shared with you, but it is sad the level of discord that has come into our political discourse lately. And this is a story from over in Vero Beach, which finally a little justice being done to some of these violent leftists who seem to think that it's appropriate when they disagree with you politically to take it out on you physically while in public. And we've all seen the videos. It's terrible what goes on over in California with Antifa and stuff. But on a much lower level, we've seen videos of just people walking around the mall, smacking people in the head who are wearing these MAGA hats, the Make America Great Again hats, and things like that. So we've got this political discourse that leftists and people who disagree with Trump supporters think it's okay to physically assault them.
Bullies.
Finally, yeah, bullies, and worse than that, just not nice people. People who think that just because I disagree with you, I can physically assault you. It's just foreign to me. But, what happened to our country with freedom of speech and diversity of ideas and a marketplace of ideas? If you've got a better idea than the other person, you certainly don't need to attack them about it, right? But this is what happened in Vero Beach at a bar called the Hurricane Grill. A 67-year-old gentleman was sitting at the bar, and he was wearing his red MAGA hat, Make America Great Again hat. And then what turned out to be a 43-year-old man kind of walks up behind him and smacks him in the bill of the cap and says to him, "You should go back to Russia, you effing communist." And as if that wasn't enough, the guy then, the 43-year-old Matthias Ajpol, and I don't know exactly how he says his name, it's A-J-P-L-E, that's kind of an interesting name, but Matthias Ajpol then circles back around to hawk a loogie on this poor 67-year-old gentleman who's just sitting at the bar, minding his own business, trying to...
That's an assault.
That's an assault. It'd be like if somebody did that to you, Pat George. I would be furious about that. That's a pure assault. Well, luckily, the gentleman at the bar was able to get the license plate as the brave Matthias Ajpol, the member of the resistance movement, sped off in his car. Luckily, the gentleman at the bar was able to get his license plate, and also, luckily, the bar has video of this. So you can actually go out there and find the video of this battery that occurred on this poor gentleman just sitting there minding his own business. And now this guy, Matthias Ajpul, is going to jail for 90 days. He's been sentenced to 90 days in jail. But do you think he'll learn his lesson? I highly doubt it, because even as he was arrested, he was apparently telling the police, I don't even care that I'm going to jail. This is actually exciting. Plus, I have more time on this earth than he does anyway. He probably feels so good about himself. That's what the perpetrator said about the victim. And so this is the world that we seem to be living in. But finally, a little bit of justice for some of these people. More exciting stuff going on in the state of Florida right now. Tomorrow starts the legislative session. And there's already 3,000 bills that have been filed to be addressed during, they got
Don't worry, they'll get them done.
They got 60 days in the legislative session, and they're going to deal with maybe 3,000 plus bills that have been filed. Now, we've got some pretty good connections with Florida legislators, so we're hoping that after the legislative session is over in about 60 days, and again, it starts tomorrow, but in about 60 days, we're going to have some of those legislators on, a senator and a member of the Florida House, and we're going to have them on to give us an update on what actually happened during the legislative session, because obviously it's too much to cover what could happen with 3,000 bills already filed. We're going to have them on after the fact and give us the down and dirty as to what really went on and what important things happened, and probably a few things that maybe aren't quite so important, but maybe just interesting as well. All right, staying in our area, I wanted to share a couple of stories with you. Now, these are not happy stories either. I don't know if you saw this one, Pat George. I didn't see it make the news, but last week a Wesley Chapel Middle School science teacher was arrested for possession of child pornography.
I just heard a little bit of this.
Yeah, 69-year-old William Crawford, a science teacher at John Long Middle School in Wesley Chapel, and he's been there since 2006. He apparently took his computer to Best Buy to have it worked on, and luckily one of the Geek Squad members saw some images on that computer that were consistent with child pornography and reported him to authorities, and he has been arrested. But I'm sure parents up in Wesley Chapel at a middle school cannot be comfortable with the type of educator that they're dealing with. And I guess you just never really know who you're dealing with. Another story along those lines. You have something?
Just wonder how some of these teachers squeak by, get in there, with because they got to have an interview process.
Well, yeah, I guess they're just extremely good liars, and they've hidden this stuff for years and years and years. And, it's not like I'm sure they don't ask them questions about it. And even if they did, I'm sure they deny it. Hey, by the way, just have to check.
Can you really ask questions about that?
I don't know, but I'm just going down my checklist, Pat George. I'm just going down the checklist, and it says here I have to ask you if you're into child porn. Oh, my God, of course not. Of course not. Well, then come to find out that maybe somebody is. And there's another story along those lines, and this one I'm sharing with you not just because these stories are really pretty horrific, but also because this guy's now moving to the Bay Area. And this was a lawyer up in Tallahassee who's now been accused, and apparently, I don't know if he denies it or not, but they found a thumb drive in his sock drawer. And the way they got onto this guy, now he's a fairly prominent attorney with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, or those who practice in front of it, the DBPR. But they found his apartment because apparently his IP address showed up as participating in some of these, what they call peer-to-peer networks, and exchanging some of these types of images. And they found on this thumb drive the abuse of children as young as 3 years old. They also found at the foot of his bed a lifelike silicone doll of a nude child.
Stop it.
I can't help it. This guy is moving now to Tampa because the Leon County judge has granted him pretrial release. So this guy's now saying he plans to move to Tampa and live with a family member. His name is David Ehring, 48 years old. And just to add one more piece of interest to it, this guy worked as a lawyer for the statewide Guardian Ad Litem program, which represents children in dependency cases. That was when he lived in Newport Richey from 2007 to 2012. So once again, you see these people who are involved with the children in the community, not all of them can be trusted. So, don't take somebody's position as indicative of who they really are, and be careful who you leave your children alone with. All right, the last story for local interest. Now, this one finally is a fairly happy story, and this is about Pinellas deputies who've solved a 31-year-old rape case. I mean, can you believe that? At that point, you got to think it's almost unsolvable. But last week, on Friday, Larry Eugene Gold was arrested in Gallatin, Tennessee, and he's going to be extradited back to Pinellas County to face charges that on September 24th, 1988, on Park Street North in St. Petersburg, he went into a business called Carrie Hawkins Distinctive Gifts, and at knife point, he raped the lady who was working there, who was, at the time he was in his 20s, and I think she was in her late 40s or early 50s because she's 82 now, and he raped her at knife point. But finally, a little bit of justice coming home from this guy. And you know how they found him?
DNA?
DNA. There you go. And it wasn't from one of these private groups, so don't worry about that. This was from the statewide DNA database, and apparently one of his relatives was also convicted of something and incarcerated, was put into this database, and because of the closeness of their two genetic makeups, they were able to tie it to this guy, Larry Eugene Gold, who's now going to be extradited back to the state of Florida, finally to face charges and some justice, hopefully, for what he's accused of doing 31 years ago. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you enjoyed all the local interest coverage we tried to do for you today. That's something that you don't get as much of anymore. And, of course, there's plenty of national news to keep your focus on. But we wanted to bring you some local stories as well and kind of bring back the old segment that we used to really focus on in the first segment. And then, of course, it took up 2 segments today because we had so much to share with you. And if you want to get in touch with us or get on Twitter with us or get to our YouTube page, you can go to morganstreetmedia.com or type in on the YouTube search bar Morgan Street Media, and you can find our page where you can listen to some of our archive and past shows. And we'd love to hear from you, interact with you on Twitter, on YouTube, wherever you may be. We don't have a very big presence on Facebook anymore, but we try to keep up at least with YouTube and Twitter. So we'd love to interact with you. We'd love to hear from you, particularly if you're enjoying the show. Got a couple of emails last week from some folks who tracked down my law firm website, streetmanlaw.com, which is great. Was glad to hear from them. One in particular who wanted to know about DOJ corruption. And do I think anything's ever really going to come of all of these investigations into the DOJ corruption? So I appreciated that email and, of course, was able to personally respond to the person who wrote me on that issue, and wanted to share with you this week some more on DOJ corruption, because I tell you what, this is a story that just doesn't seem to end. And I've got to tell you, looking back into our archives and looking back at some of my past posts on the show, which I had to do last week because I'd got a new phone, which required me to go through and clean up a lot of stuff on my old phone. It caused me to go back through, and it really hit me like a ton of bricks. We have been covering the same story since early 2017.
And why is that? It's just, nothing changes.
Nothing has changed, and nothing is happening. And you talk about running out the clock. And, folks, I don't know if you remember the whole, and I guess some of you do here in the Bay Area because apparently it's pretty popular here, but what they call the Q phenomenon, or these postings from QAnon. And I mean, QAnon, we were on to QAnon. If you remember, Pat George, almost immediately we were interested in QAnon and checking it out, and very, very quickly figured out that it was not true. Now, a lot of people, I'm sure I'm going to take some heat for saying that because a lot of people are so committed to the story. But if you go back and look historically at what Q had predicted would happen, none of it's come true. None of it's come true. I mean, remember the John Huber investigation? That was the one that Jeff Sessions put in place. Oh, undercover Huber, they called it. And we got guys whose entire career, these are like almost mainstream journalists now. Their entire career was built on reporting on the Q phenomenon. There's a guy who works for Epoch Times now, And that's what he built his entire career on. And I remember interacting with him when he was fairly young in the business on Twitter, and he was telling me what a fool I was for not understanding and believing in the Q phenomenon. Now he's like got a full-time journalist gig for Epoch Times, and nobody seems to want to look back into the past and look at what this idiot has written before, because he totally bought into it hook, line, and sinker and didn't check to see if any of this crap ever came true. Like the 40,000, 20,000 indictments, 40,000 and 60,000 sealed indictments. Now, I saw somebody post the other day, yeah, but there's still 120,000 sealed indictments that we don't know about. Remember, John McCain didn't pass away. He was secreted off to Gitmo to face a military tribunal, that Q told us, and on and on and on. And it was all malarkey, as Joe Biden would say. It was all malarkey. None of it has come true. And now we find out last week that the Huber investigation, which was not even an investigation, but the Huber investigation has been closed with no findings of any wrongdoing by the Clintons or the Clinton Foundation. Now, meanwhile, if you look into what John Huber has said, he told the IG and others that he actually didn't conduct an investigation because the IG, the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, was looking into it, and he didn't want to get into Horowitz's way. Now, this is the guy that Jeff Sessions supposedly appointed as an alternative to a special counsel to look into the Clinton Foundation and the Uranium One scandal, where they sold off about a fifth of our country's uranium reserves to Russia, right? I mean, my goodness, Russia is apparently our most significant enemy of all time. I mean, if Trump even says the word Russia, they make up an entire conspiracy theory about it. But now you've got Hillary Clinton getting $100 million deposited into the Clinton Foundation. At the same time, she's approving of the sale of a fifth of our country's uranium reserves to Russian entities. So, I mean, is that the real Russian conspiracy? I don't know. I didn't get a chance to look into it. And the guy who did get a chance to look into it, John Huber, he didn't do anything. Well, now he's closed down his investigation. And we'll have to put quotes around that. We'll put air quotes around investigation, because it's obvious he didn't do anything at all. And you hear from, there was a whistleblower who came out and said, hey, I got some stuff to tell you about the Uranium One scandal and the bribes that were flowing back and forth on this scandal that the Clinton.
And what happened to him?
Nothing. He was never even interviewed. His name is Doug Campbell, and he's represented by D.C. lawyer Joe DeGeneva, who's, fairly frequent guest on these different media shows if they're more conservative oriented. But he was never even interviewed by the Huber investigation. In fact, Huber didn't investigate or interview anybody. And that has been the subject of discussions in Congress going back years now, going back into 2018. People in Congress, remember, they tried to have Huber in to testify, and he wouldn't show. And they've said, they're very concerned because all these people that they're talking to, and we're talking about like Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan and others, all the people they're talking to have never even been interviewed by John Huber. So what is the guy doing? And the truth is he wasn't doing anything. So now he's closed his investigation, and you've got Hillary Clinton tweeting out how, finally, after all these years of false accusations against me and my family, these are so false. Now we finally know the truth, that there's nothing to any of these allegations. Well, the whole thing was a complete farce. And we've got plenty more of DOJ corruption to tell you about. I'm even having trouble figuring out which direction should I go next, because I got 3 other instances.
Go north.
Exactly. Head north, young man, just to tell you about today. 3 other instances, and I'll start out with Cheryl Atkins's new complaint, because she's finally been able to determine some of the people that spied on her computer. Now, this is going back to the days of the Benghazi scandal. The U.S. government infiltrated, illegally hacked her computer and put some spyware on it to report on her. And, of course, in the interim, she learned about that, but she didn't know who was behind it. So she filed suit against a bunch of people she named John Doe, because that's what you do in a lawsuit when you don't know who you're actually suing. You put John Doe. Well, the court eventually threw out a bunch of her claims because it said she wasn't quick enough to figure out who the John Does were. Meanwhile, the DOJ, the defendants, have produced no paper, not a single piece of paper. So the game is, if you can't just use your psychic abilities to figure it out, and you can't do it within a 3-year time frame, then you lose. You lose just because you don't know who it was that actually did this. But some of her claims are allowed to continue, and she's been able to name some people. Well, one of the big names that you'll certainly recognize, I'm going to show you his picture because you remember him from testifying in Congress, Rod Rosenstein. That hero to bureaucrats everywhere, who I personally don't care for, as you listeners well know. We've done entire shows on Rod Rosenstein, that sanctimonious son of a gun who testified to Congress, he threatened members of Congress to investigate them if they didn't back off. Well, apparently he's the guy that authorized and was leading the illegal spying operation into journalist Cheryl Atkinson's computer. And she's finally named him. Apparently the only way she learned that he was involved was some whistleblower came to her. We don't know all the details, but what she does put in her complaint is pretty significant. And it started back in the days of the Benghazi scandal in 2012, and also the Fast and Furious scandal was going on right around that time. That was 2011. So she was investigating both of those. What happened in the gun walking scandal, where the federal government was letting the cartels basically buy up all these U.S. firearms, and the game was, we'll track where they go, and we'll get to find out all this information about the cartels, about where the guns went. Of course, none of that came to pass. The only thing that came to pass is we armed the Mexican cartels. That's the only thing that came to pass, but that was a huge scandal. Also, the Benghazi scandal. I mean, for a president who supposedly didn't have any scandals his entire time in office, I mean, those are some pretty big scandals. And Cheryl Atkinson was investigating them, and lo and behold, she's getting spied on illegally, I will add, by Rod Rosenstein, who was then the U.S. attorney in Baltimore and was the head of the task force that was spying on her. There were others involved, one of whom's actually in federal prison right now for corruption, and several other people who were involved in spying on Cheryl Atkinson's computer. But we look forward to see where that lawsuit may go. Now, if history tells us anything, unfortunately, it tells us it's probably not going anywhere. Kind of like the Hoover investigation. It's already been frustrated. She's already had her claims against Eric Holder, the attorney general, dismissed because she couldn't name all these people who were secretly spying on her because the government wouldn't give her the information.
You're talking about all these names that we don't even hear about that much anymore, and all of that's still not answered.
Well, the mainstream media is right there in the pockets of these corrupt Washington, D.C. swamp officials. I don't care what you want to call them. You want to call them deep state, whatever you want to call them. These people are the shadow government, the bureaucrats who actually run things because they know how the whole process works, and they have the power, and they don't hesitate to use it against Americans. They don't hesitate. And meanwhile, we get told by even conservative shows about how the rank and file, this, that, and the other, the rank and file of the FIB, the FBI. But let's call them the FIB because that seems to be all they do. The rank and file, they're all good people. They're all good people. Well, why aren't more whistleblowers coming forward then? Why aren't more people trying to expose this corruption that apparently goes all the way to the top of the organization? And you tell me, if the top of the organization is completely corrupted, what do you think the bottom of the organization looks like? I don't know. But I have real questions. And I mean, we've got a lot more questions about this. I hate to hear the music because I literally have several more stories just along this line. Thank you, Pat George, for turning that off. Now, don't forget to tell me when we're about to run out of time. But last week, the FISA court appointed a guy who's completely bought and sold for the Obama administration, doesn't believe there was any illegal FBI spying. His name's David Chris, and it's a complete joke. They appointed him to investigate the illegal FBI spying and all of the misrepresentations made to the FISA court. It's absolutely crazy. Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show, and I just got to touch on a couple of more of these stories. I can't really go through them in detail, or we won't have an Out There segment, and we guard that jealously. But I want to just touch on a couple more of these, because we touched, and all we did was really touch on the appointment of that, what they call amicus, or friend of the FISA court, David Chris, which is, as Devin Nunes put it, completely ridiculous that they picked that guy. Of all the people in D.C. they could have picked, they picked that guy to investigate it. I mean, he's on record on the Rachel Maddow show and others, and on the Lawfare blog, where he's a regular writer, he's on record supporting the conspiracy theory that the FBI wasn't doing anything illegal. And now that the IG Inspector General report came out December 9th, we all know that the FBI was making serious and significant misrepresentations and omissions to the FISA court, and there were more of them as time went on. So the early applications to spy on Carter Page had 7, and by the time they got to the 4th application, they had 17. So they were making more misrepresentations as time went on. And one of the people making those misrepresentations and who was responsible for verifying the facts supporting that application was FBI supervising special agent Joseph Pientka III. Now, that gentleman has been requested for congressional testimony since at least May of 2018 by Senator Grassley, back when somebody with a little bit of guts was in charge of the Judiciary Committee. And now we've got Lindsey Graham, who won't do anything, is just going to run out the clock and ride out his chairmanship through early 2020, and he's already announced that will be the end of his chairmanship. But at the time, Chuck Grassley was at least trying to uncover some of this, and remember, he had Matt Whitaker on his staff, who I think was a good actor, and trying to look into this, and they were trying to interview Joseph Pientka, the same guy who falsified and signed under penalty of perjury the verifications of the Carter Page FISA app, and was responsible for putting together the Woods file, which was the factual backup for the application, which we now know contained significant material misrepresentations and omissions. Well, they shipped that guy off to the San Francisco field office. And now, after the IG report came out and it became clear that Pientka had done so many things wrong and made misrepresentations to the court, and that happened just December of last year, December 9th of 2019. They totally scrubbed his name from the FBI website, so he doesn't even appear as an agent in the San Francisco field office anymore. Now, he's probably still there, one would guess, but he doesn't appear on the website.
And he puts up with that.
I just don't understand. Does Bill Barr not know about this stuff? Is it just, these different agencies have different command structures. Can he only handle so much at once? I just don't know. But there is so much corruption here that needs to be rooted out, and I just don't see we're running out of time. Statutes of limitation on some of this stuff are going to be running. We need to get these people, and is it ever going to happen? If you made me put all my money on it one way or the other, I hate to say it, I don't want to be a negative person, but I have to say no. Let history be the judge. This is not happening. Look at the Hoover investigation. Remember how much that was supposed to yield? It didn't happen. And now Breitbart, I just got to touch on this. Breitbart's got a story because we were trying to figure out who wanted that salacious and unverified Steele dossier, as Jim Comey himself called it. Who wanted that in the intelligence community assessment? Remember, that was delivered to President Trump in early January of 2017, and then became a huge news story where the Steele dossier got out, the hook being that they delivered it to President Trump. So who wanted that salacious and unverified story? And I'll just leave it at the golden showers. Who wanted that in the ICA, the intelligence community assessment? Well, now because of some of the emails that have come out with the IG Inspector General report just in December, we see that it was Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe were the two primary people who were pushing for that to be included in the ICA. These people are rotten to the core. They're political operatives, and I sure hope that John Durham is running a real investigation and these people are really going to be held accountable. But I'll tell you what, I ain't holding my breath. Based on history. While we wanted to get into some of the Iran stuff, we really don't have time to do that. All I'll say is go out there and check out some of the videos of the protests going on in Iran, who's now finally admitted that, oh, yeah, they did shoot down that Ukrainian airliner.
Sorry.
Common sense serves you once again, folks. Common sense serves you once again. Obviously, they shot it down. Now, the real question is why that particular flight, because that flight path was being used by several other airplanes. In fact, 4 or 5 had just gone through there previously. So this was no accident. And why that particular flight? Who was on that flight?
A lot of Ukrainians.
A lot of Ukrainians, some Canadians. And, of course, we don't know the answer to that, but that is one of the key questions that you want to be asking. Now, we'll try to run through some of these out there segment stories. I don't know, I've got 3 of them, but I want to tell you some other questions you need to be asking. You know, what happened to the Epstein video of outside of his cell during that first alleged suicide attempt, and that occurred on July 23rd of 2019. Remember when he still had Nicholas Tartaglione, the ex-cop, as his cellmate and beefy guy?
I thought the camera was broke.
Oh, well, no, they actually had that at some point, and first they said they had it, then they said they didn't have it, then they said they had it again, and as of December of last year, December 19th, 2019, the prosecutors, and guess who the prosecutor is on this case? I mean, this stuff is just floors me. It's Jim Comey's daughter, Maureen Comey. I mean, are you kidding me? She's the one that got in charge of the Epstein prosecution. Well, guess what? Now they've come back and said, you know what? We thought we had it. We didn't think we had it. And then we thought we had it. And then we told them to give it to us. And that happened on January 3rd. They actually gave us the tape. So they were really Johnny on the spot with getting this evidence, right? They went right out and got a hold of it. No, they waited till January 3rd after Tartaglione's lawyer had requested it. And then apparently the poor Metropolitan Correctional Center, who just can't seem to get anything right, they delivered a tape and learned, oh, I'm sorry, we've preserved the wrong footage. This was from a different tier, and it's because the system was mislabeled. Now, look, these kind of mistakes can happen, but do all of them happen at the same time in the same case repeatedly? I don't know. That sounds fishy. I tell you what, I'm going to rely on my common sense rather than believe in the nonsense headlines that we've been seeing for 4 years now from the lamestream media. Well, we're not going to get much to these other 2 stories. Walmart's testing some robots that are apparently 10 times faster than human beings called the AlphaBot at fulfilling grocery orders. So now you want to go and pick up your groceries there at Walmart. That's the new service that they're offering. Well, now they're having robots actually go do the picking off the shelves for you. And guess what? They're 10 times faster than humans. So it isn't going to be too long before all these human jobs are replaced.
And they're dressing nicer.
By robots. Last story, we don't have time to do it justice. We'll save it for another time. It's about DNA vaccines. And boy, that's one you're really going to want to hear. So we'll try and hold that one over till next week. Folks, thanks for joining us. I really hope something happens with this DOJ corruption, and I hope you do too. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.